So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lars Christensen. I'm the chair of the Department of Sociology. I'd like to welcome you all to the 6th annual Torstensen Lecture in Sociology. The Torstensen Lecture is named after Joel Torstensen, who helped found Augsburg's Sociology Department in 1947. Joel Torstensen also helped found Augsburg's Metro Urban Studies program and the Department of Social Work. The annual Torstensen Lecture in Sociology promotes the field of sociology and Augsburg's contribution to the field through sharing and exchange of ideas between the Augsburg community and invited guest lecturers. Today's guest is Penny Angel. Penny Angel received her doctorate in sociology from the University of Chicago in 1995 and is a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota. She has studied conflict and decision-making in local religious communities in the book Congregations in Conflict, which Augsburg has a copy of this in our library. I should note that for those of you who are interested in research methods, this work included field work of 23 congregations, over 230 intensive interviews, and document analysis of business meetings, sermons, congregation history, and the like. Professor Etchell has also analyzed how religion shapes cultural modes of race, citizenship, gender, and family in ways that influence how Americans draw boundaries in everyday life. That's in the work called Religion and Family in Changing Society. Most recently, she has written a review of cultural approaches to the study of religion for the Annual Review of Sociology. She's beginning a new research project on how religious, scientific, and legal frameworks intersect to shape how people understand contemporary social issues, and writing a review of cultural approaches to the sociological study of religion. She is the incoming chair of the religion section of the American Sociological Association, which, incidentally, that signals in our profession widespread respect for somebody's work, that they would end up in the position of chairing a particular section of the ASA. Her research has appeared in a range of journals, including Religion and American Culture, the American Sociological Review, Journal of Marriage and the Family, Social Problems, Sociological Forum, and the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion. Please join me in giving a welcome to Penny Angel.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, and I'm very happy to be here for the Torstensen Lecture. And I am planning to leave plenty of time for question and answer at the end. There are a lot of slides, but we are not going. The talk is not as long as it may appear, so, and I will make sure, and my understanding is that we wrap by 6:30, yes? And so, but we will have plenty of time then in that time frame for question and answer, and I really look forward to hearing what you have to say. I'm going to start today by giving people a little bit of background. The title of the talk is Religion's Role in American Public Life, and in particular, I'm interested in this question of how sociologists approach the understanding of religion in American public life. And today's talk, there will be some sociology in today's talk. It will be the part where we talk about why I think sociologists don't necessarily ask the right kinds of questions about religion's role in public life, or rather that they ask a very limited set of questions, and that's not always helpful. But I don't assume anymore, after giving this talk, or talks like it, I don't assume that people have a lot of background on religion in the U.S., so I always start just with some facts and figures. And no, there's not a pop quiz associated with the talk, but I thought this would be good to kind of bring us all up to speed. When I talk about religion in American life, one of the things that I think we need to know is just, well, what is religion like in our national context? And in any kind of lecture on this, and I should say, I always do a background slide like this. This is drawn from various data sources. The General Social Survey, the American Religious Landscape Survey, and also a survey that Robert Putnam did for his book, American Grace, which he very nicely reproduces a lot of his statistics, both in the book itself. and in the appendix to the book. But for people who are interested, if you think this kind of background would be useful for a class paper or a project or something that you're working on, I can very easily direct you to websites that give you this kind of information. I can also very easily just share these slides as well, if that would be helpful. So when you look at this, you can see that there's really, the United States has a distribution of religious identities that has remained relatively stable. About 33% of the American public is what we would call evangelical Protestant. That is how they would self-identify. That's roughly the same percentage who would also go to an evangelical Protestant church. Although the self-identification figure of 33% is a little bit high. If you just count people who go to evangelical Protestant churches, it's about 27%. About 21% of Americans are liberal or moderate Protestants. About 14% of Americans belong to what we might have thought of as historic mainline Protestant denominations. Those would be things like the United Methodist Church, the United Church of Christ, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, those kinds of denominations. Roughly a quarter of Americans are Catholic. This figure has not changed much. However, the racial composition of that figure has changed a lot. In 1990, some high percentage of those would have been white Catholics. Now, a fairly large percentage is Latino Catholics from various national origins. Again, all other combined, all of the smaller religious groups that you might think about, that we might have heard about, especially if we had a class where we talked about, say, the 1965 Immigration Reform Act and how that brought more diversity, another wave of immigration to America and more racial and religious diversity. That is true, but as we can see, it hasn't really led to high rates of other religious identities. The one shift that I do have an arrow pointing to here is the growth of those who claim no religious identity. And those are called nuns in sociological parlance because we lack imagination in our terminology. So these are the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And the thing to note here is that the big growth of those was in the 1990s. And most commentators feel that that number grew in the 1990s for a couple of different kinds of reasons. And one kind of reason was just demographic. People with kids go to church at higher rates and claim religious identities at higher rates than people without kids. And so one of the things that started to happen in the 90s was people were getting married later in life. They were delaying childbearing. There were just fewer people in the population who were the most likely to be religiously involved. So that explains some of this shift. But the other part of the shift was driven, and this is by research by Michael Hount and Claude Fisher at Berkeley, suggests that the other part of this was driven by people's reaction against the politicization of religion in American public life. That a lot of this, about half of this shift, came from people who would formerly have called themselves moderate or liberal Protestant, that those who were not super religious in that category went ahead and left organized religion and stopped claiming a religious identity, in part because they associated religion with politicized, politically conservative religious expression in the public sphere. So there was kind of a backlash against that. This figure of 21%, I actually couldn't find reliable figures for 1990 that broke the data down the way I wanted it broken down. But this figure in 1990 would have been higher. It would have been 28 or 29%. And I know that because I've seen other data sources, but I could not confirm that in time for this talk. So those folks, the shift there, some of this shift is people shifting away from this moderate or liberal Protestant identity, in a sense of feeling just distant from religion because of all of this politicized religious activity. And again, just kind of some random figures, but I think some interesting figures. If we think about what religion means in American life, for most Americans, for a strong plurality of Americans, it means some kind of organized religious involvement. About half attending monthly or more in 1990, about 42% now. Weekly church attendance is again about half of that. So not super high rates, but reasonably high rates if you try to think of some other voluntary organized activity that half of Americans participate in on a regular basis, whether that's community sports or community arts. These are still reasonably high figures. They're not as high as Some people think they used to be, but I think that those older figures are probably not good data. So I think this is probably even relatively stable. The percent who believe in God, regardless of how you think about it, Americans are a believing nation and a belonging nation. This is based on a general social survey item, and it has several different things that you can say about your belief in God. This figure is the combined total for people who say any kind of belief in God, including a higher power or this is a stricter, this is also based off the same measure. And one of the response items is you can say, I believe in God and I have no doubts about God's existence. And that is upwards, it's between 60-65% of Americans really declare a very strong religious faith. And again, the percent who believe that the Bible is the actual word of God and is to be taken literally word for word, about a third, not accidental, about roughly the same percentage as those who would self-identify as evangelical. And when it comes to belief measures of what it means to be evangelical, this is the most widely and commonly used belief measure in research for what that might, if you're trying to tap into what that actually might mean, what that evangelical identity might be about. So this is our backdrop, a nation with high rates of religious belief and belonging, with a relatively narrow range of religious expression. Protestants divided roughly to moderate, liberal, evangelical, Catholics, a few minority religious groups. A growing proportion of the society is not religious. Those figures are particularly high amongst people your age, about 25 to 30% of people in your age group. I'm speaking here to the students. As distinct from, say, my age group, which is a different age group. About 25 to 30% of folks in your age group are not religiously affiliated, won't claim a religious identity, never go to church, don't say that religion is particularly salient to them. There are big debates about what that means, and if that number is a number that will be stable as folks your age through the life course. In general, in previous generations, people have gotten more religious as they get older, for all those kinds of or have become more religiously involved as they get older. It's not clear if that's going to happen with your generation or not, in part because your life courses have changed a lot, in particular patterns of marriage, patterns of child rearing, also patterns of work and geographic mobility, and all of those things influence the likelihood that you will become involved in a long-term way in any community institution, or that you will claim a religious identity. So it's just not quite clear where that's going.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Did you come across a category of, I think it was like religiously unaffiliated?
Those are the nuns.
Well, within that though, I'm thinking of a recent Pew study that said within the unaffiliated is about that 16%. Within that, about a third still claimed religion to be important, but they themselves were not affiliated. Did you come across anything like that?
That is an internally, this happens in my undergrad class too.
That 17%.
This is an internally differentiated group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The best research I've seen is a study by Baker and Smith that got published, where they had a breakdown of some of this group. And so yes, I would say a third to a half do something religious, and some of them
they see the importance of it, but they're not.
Right, or they might say that they pray occasionally, or they might occasionally. Or they might imagine that in some big, if it came to a ritual like getting married or having a funeral, that they would want some religious involvement.
Sure.
So, but there's no what makes the reason these are classified as none is if you ask them on a survey if they belong, they won't claim that, and they're also not organizationally involved in any kind of routine way. So yeah, so again, what the meaning of this category is not entirely clear. It's a newly emerging category in terms of its historical interest. In the 50s, that was about 2%. It went up to about 7 in the 60s. It went up to about 14 in the 90s. So it's kind of a historically emerging category. I don't think there's been a lot of good research on it.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So what does all this mean for religion's presence in public life? We have a backdrop now of how Americans are religious, what their religious identities are, how involved they are. what is the background for thinking about religion's role in public life in the U.S.? And when you say public life, you can mean a lot of things. When I say public life here, I'm thinking about things like, how do we encounter religion in the news media? How are religious persons or groups covered in the media? And that's one of our main sources of information about our contemporary society. What issues are capturing the public imagination, receiving national press coverage, talked about in public discourse? And also public institutions. How do religious groups and leaders in the United States affect our public institutions? How do they lobby and have an effect on government, whether that's federal or state or local, on law and public policy, on institutional arenas like higher education? And finally, how does religion shape individual attitudes and beliefs about issues of public importance, whether that is politics and voting and candidate preference, or whether, again, it is policy or issue-oriented kinds of beliefs. And when we think about religion in public life, when I teach my undergraduate class on this at the U, we talk a lot about two themes that emerge again and again, particularly in media accounts, but also that are relevant to thinking about religion in public policy in the U.S., and that is the theme of religious insiders and outsiders, and the theme of the culture war.
Do you mean to say more moms or Mormons?
Mormons.
Okay.
Mormons, thank you. I'm not quite sure what I said, but yes, I meant Mormons. Thank you. Yeah, good catch. Good catch. When we think about religious insiders and outsiders, there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind, I think. Not only does the United States have very high rates of religious believing and religious belonging, but there's also what I call a strong cultural preference for Christianity. Americans tend to think of Christianity as a valued part of our shared cultural heritage. And it is an important part of how most Americans imagine our national identity. Now this is changing, again, it is changing most rapidly amongst younger generations, but it's still a pretty big theme. 74% of Americans, if you ask them on a survey, and there are caveats that we could make about survey data, but if you ask 74% of Americans on a survey, they will tell you that the United States is a Christian nation, and they say, well, that is a good thing. And this reports on a two-part question that we asked on our American Mosaic Project survey. It was a survey that we ran out of the sociology department at the University of Minnesota. The data are now 9 years old. I think it was 2003 that we asked this question. And this reports, we asked a two-part question. First we asked, is the U.S. a Christian nation? And people could either say yes or no. And if they said yes, it's a Christian nation, we said, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And then if they said no, it's not a Christian nation, we asked again, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? So this 74% of Americans is the combined percentage of people who say yes, it's a Christian nation, and that's a good thing, and people who say no, it's not a Christian nation, and that's a bad thing. Right? So there's a preference in either of those response patterns for Christianity. But well over 60% of Americans, I think it's 63, say it is a Christian nation, and that's a good thing. So in some sense, right, this is not really news. This is a pattern that's been around for a while. On the same survey, we asked people, should society's standards of right and wrong be based on God's laws? 40% of Americans agree about that. Right? More of Catholics agree with this than Protestants. This echoes a kind of Catholic natural law phrasing, and we did that for a reason. We always ask about biblical literalism, but that's a question that's really keyed more toward Protestants. This was a question that we thought would pick up more patterns amongst Catholics, and that tended to be the case. And again, younger cohorts are different. In younger cohorts, more people identify as liberal, but conservatives are more passionate. So when we think about how are these patterns going to change among younger cohorts, again, I think it's unclear what is going to happen. And if we ask the same question in 20 years, what patterns would we get? I don't know. But I don't think it's very clear. I don't think there's clear support for some sense that this cultural preference for Christianity is going away anytime soon. And we think that this is key to understanding the way that non-dominant religious groups are dealt with, thought about in public life, both in the media and again, how they might interact with dominant institutions. two different responses to President Barack Obama's inaugural address. From CNN, Randy Ballmer, who's a scholar, himself an evangelical, I believe at Barnard College in New York, writing in an editorial, President Obama's mention of non-believers in his inaugural address represents an important broadening of the circle of acceptability in American life, an acknowledgement of our growing diversity, and a fuller embrace of the principles articulated in our nation's charter documents. Melinda Hennenberger on AOL News, and it was an editorial that they had picked up. Not everyone was happy with President Barack Obama's nod to non-believers and non-Christians in his inaugural address, and some of the stiff criticism about Obama's religious inclusiveness is coming from African-American Christians who maintain that, no, all faiths were not actually created equal. And so the point of this is just, this is actually, I think, quite a simple point. The role and status of non-Christian and non-religious persons is contested in American public life, and it is contested, we argue in our work, because of this cultural preference for Christianity. That is to say, it is contested not only by the 10 or 15% of Americans who are themselves highly religious and highly political about it. That's about 10 to 15% of Americans. And again, I've seen different figures on that. I've not seen anything higher than 15%. But headlines and stories like this aren't effective if it's only 10 or 15% with whom it's going to resonate. These themes of insider and outsider status and the cultural preference for Christianity resonates much more broadly than just a small politicized evangelical base in the United States. And one of the things that happens as a result of this cultural preference for Christianity and the politicization of religious identities is that we get religious groups defining oppositional identities. Atheism perhaps has always been, but it is certainly becoming a consciously oppositional identity in the United States. The Freedom from Religion Foundation is a Wisconsin-based group. It was founded in 1978. Its website lists 13,000 members. It's been active in raising awareness and raising money for things like this billboard, Imagine No Religion, and also a bus campaign, an advertising campaign on public buses in Wisconsin. I'm an atheist and that's it. I believe there's nothing we can know except that we should be kind to each other and do what we can for other people. Katharine Hepburn. And this organization is interesting for a couple of reasons, I think. But one is that it opposes both conservative and liberal stances on religion in public life, as they have traditionally been expressed in the U.S. The conservative stance on religion in public life has been a stance that favors not only religious expression, but religious particularity, right? That you should speak out based on your religious identity, that you should make claims in religious terms and using religious language in American public life. That's religious particularism, and religious conservatives and political conservatives have often been in favor of that in American public life. Liberal religious groups have often been in favor of a public sphere where you have conservative religious voices, but they're balanced by liberal religious voices. And one of the things that this organization is about is really making a strong claim that we don't want balance, right? What we want is a truly secular public arena of discourse, not just a formally secular state with the separation of church and state. And this is not the only organized group out there. There is a new, founded in, I think, 2010, political party, the National Atheist Party, whose motto is, from diversity and reason, unity. Now, you've probably never heard of this party, right? Atheists themselves are 2 to 3% of the American public. This group hasn't exactly done a great job with fundraising and advertising, right? But it's interesting that this identity is becoming embraced as a consciously organized oppositional identity. And that's historically new, at least in the 20th century. Finally, I wanted to just touch on the theme of the status of Muslims in American society. A cultural preference for Christianity has seemed to be, again, since the wave of new immigration in 1965, it has seemed to be pretty compatible with and tolerant of expressions of religiosity based in, say, Buddhism, right, and other kinds of Eastern spiritualities, it has not been all that tolerant of Muslim religious expressions. And of course, in the 9/11 context, we have had many headlines like this. This was 2009, though, a long time after 9/11. This is a story from the Minnesota Daily, but these stories I've seen in the Strib and the Pioneer Press and other local sites as well. Somali and other immigrants from the Horn of Africa are quickly becoming to the Twin Cities what Cubans have become to Miami. Fleeing their war-torn homeland, our East African population has built a large and palpable presence here in our state. The refusal to handle pork products by some Somalis and the unwillingness of some immigrant taxi drivers to transport alcoholic beverages have served to stoke racial tensions. If they can't live by our rules, then they should go back to where they came from. That was a common response from the local community. And one of the reasons that I always include this slide, since I discovered it in 2009, is that it shows very nicely, I think, that in the American context, a cultural preference for Christianity is in some ways a polite and socially acceptable way of talking about white society and white preferences and white values. The story about Somalis makes it clear that one of the, and there are many, I think, reasons why a Muslim identity is problematic in the American context, but certainly in the local Minnesota context, the reasons that a Muslim identity is perceived as problematic has also to do with race and ethnicity and national origin and cultural customs and a whole array of things which intersect. That is to say, it is not just about religion, but the religious identity becomes a carrier for and a marker of all of these other kinds of differences, some of which are harder to talk about in public life than religious differences are.
Concerning this, though, in your work, would you say that it's, because when I remember hearing about this, one of the things that we heard a lot in Minnesota was the inconvenience of it. And I didn't come across a lot of talk about religion in terms of just things coming from news reports. But I remember hearing people were just upset if they were going to a line or they were getting in a taxi and how rude and inconvenient it was. Does that happen to go hand in hand with the values and Christian identity as well?
I understood everything except your last question.
Oh,
Sorry, I'm sure it's me.
What I'm wondering is like, this seems like it's a huge inconvenience also for Americans because it does not coincide with our values. And so I was wondering, can that be
Oh, if the
lumped
values make us see, oh, this is a really big inconvenience.
because it seemed like it was more of an inconvenience for Americans, and I'm wondering, could you lump that in again with religion, or does this kind of situation, is this exempt from your research?
Oh, I don't think this is exempt at all. I mean, I moved to Minnesota, and I had lived before then in states that didn't have blue laws. I was shocked. I was, just been here. I'm pulling into the parking lot on Certix on a Sunday. I'm running my errands, and the liquor store is closed. And I was outraged. And I was outraged. And I sat in my car, and I said to myself, those Christians.
Yeah.
Right? And so that reaction may strike you as a little bit over the top, right? But I guess my point is, I'm like the minority saying in my car, pounding my fist on the dashboard, those Christians, right? It's because I'm this weird academic outlier that I think this way. And I guess what I'm saying is, if you ask yourself a question, there are lots of things that are organized around Christian preferences, including the fact that you can't shop for certain things on Sundays, or, for a very long time, the only holidays that we got off were Good Friday and Christian holidays. Now that's not the case anymore. There's a long list of religious holidays that we all recognize at the university. And so I guess I would argue that this is exactly what I'm talking about, because one of the things we don't even see is the inconvenience we as a society. I see it, like I said, I'm a weird outlier, right? We don't see as a society the ways in which even our just daily laws and institutions facilitate a Christian lifestyle, but might make it more difficult to engage in a Muslim lifestyle. So I guess what I'm saying is, this is where the rubber hits the road, right? This is where we see these kinds of cultural preferences. What do we take for granted is that's just normal, and of course we should accommodate it. Of course I shouldn't be able to buy wine for dinner, I'm sorry it bothers me. I know, I sound like a lush, but I'm actually not. But it bothers me, right? So what do you take for granted as being, oh, of course, that's just the way things are, versus, wow, that's a real inconvenience. I think it's all part of the story. And of course, there are certainly other ways that we see this too. This was a much more recent survey, 2011, conducted by the Public Religion Research Institute. and it was views about Islam and American Muslims. American Muslims want to establish Sharia law. 30% of Americans think that. 54% of Tea Party members think that. Muslims are not an important part of the state's community. Now that's a really strong statement, right? 43% of Americans are willing to endorse it, and again, 57% of the Tea Party members. Islam is at odds with American values. The people who are least likely to say that are Democrat, and you would still get 40% of Democrats ponying up on that one, 66% of Tea Party members. And this is what cultural preference is. Cultural preference is saying there is a dominant culture and other groups either fit or don't.
Could you just say something about do you know in this study, how was Islam defined for the respondents?
I think that my best guess is that they don't. That they don't want to, that they just ask people based on, because one of the things they want to pick up is, what are your stereotypes?
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, but I'm pretty sure that this was just part of a, call you up, hi, do you mind if I ask you some questions, keep you on the phone for 20 minutes, say thank you, and that's it. Which is how most of this research was conducted. And I have more on views, and I'm just going to very, very quickly go through this. This group does not at all agree with my vision of American society. This was the same American Mosaic Project survey in 2003. We asked about a list of a whole bunch of groups. And so the form the question took was we said to people, we're going to read you a list of groups in American society. And when I read you the name of the group, I want you to think about whether members of that group share your vision of America. Okay? And they would say, okay. So then you would read the list of groups. And the list of groups was randomized. People did not all get them in the same order. 40% of Americans said atheists do not agree with my vision of America. 26% of Americans said Muslims do not. And this was the strongest category of response. They do not at all share. We also asked a question about intermarriage. 47.6% of Americans said I would disapprove if my child wanted to marry an atheist. 33% I would disapprove if my child wanted to marry a Muslim. So again, one of the reasons that we can think and talk about the importance or relevance of a cultural preference for Christianity is by looking at attitudes toward these outgroups that help Americans think about and define for themselves the boundaries of that. What does it mean to be non-Christian, or what does it mean to be Christian? Atheists and Muslims are groups that we can hold up as exemplary of a boundary. And actually, attitudes about these groups may say very little about atheists or Muslims. It may say a lot about American society and what we consider to be central to that.
Do you know the main reason why somebody wouldn't want an atheist to marry their child? And the reason why I'm wondering is it seems a lot harder to have a relationship or a marriage based off of, like, especially Christian and Muslim, where they're drastically different. So is there any reason behind that?
And again, we didn't, that's a great question, and again, it's the limits of a survey, we didn't ask. And I think, that's, I really wouldn't want to guess. But I think that would be, again, a kind of something that would be very useful to follow up on. Finally, I can't help it. Mitt Romney is such good fodder for my lectures, for my undergraduate classes this semester. That's all I'm doing. This poor guy, I'm just dogging him through the press. What did he do today that I can talk about? But again, what I think is really interesting is these were articles that appeared within 4 days of each other. One's in U.S. News and World Report, one is on Politico.com. But it's not hard to find these kinds of headlines. And it shows the active contestation and thinking about what does it mean to be Mormon, right? That is actively up for debate and up for grabs right now because of Mitt Romney, right? Is it something that makes him more American because it was a church that was founded in the United States and is founded on kind of core American values and, in many ways it's a distinctly American faith, and that goes on with a longer article saying what that means. Or is his faith a problem? I think it's a subtle issue. It may not be a problem in many states. It may be a problem in many states, not just Alabama, says Bentley, who is not endorsing anybody yet. But I do believe Republicans are looking to see who can win the presidency, and they're going to look at that more than anything else. Is this going to be a barrier or not? active contestation and debate about that, in a way that it's just hard to imagine any kind of Christian identity being debated. The question is settled on Christian identity. Is it an asset or not in the American political scene? It's an asset. It's really an open debate about what Mormonism means in American context. I'm not going to give you a whole lot of more detail on this. I might skip through some of these slides. In addition to just insiders and outsiders, another theme that we see in the news media is that religion is divisive. Religion is covered as a divisive force, and we hear and think and talk about the culture war in American life. And I just have this graph to show you. As you can tell, one of the things, I'm a survey data junkie. But I like this one. This is a recent survey conducted in September of last year by the University of Maryland. And it's a poll that I have up here just to show you that many Americans feel that their religious faith carries with it the obligation to be informed about and to participate in major policy arenas. 65% says that they see relieving poverty and hunger as a spiritual obligation. 50% of Americans say that they see preventing abortions as a spiritual obligation. 45% preventing innocent civilians from dying in war. 30% preventing the loss of species. And then we have nuclear weapons pollution and climate change. So one of the things I think to think about based on this slide is the fact that religion is not going away anytime soon when it comes to an active public presence across policy arenas. These are not figures that suggest that the culture war is just a thing of the past or something of your parents' generation. These figures suggest it is something that is here to stay. And these were just kind of recent culture wars headlines. I think they're kind of self-explanatory. The bishop's fight to repackage discrimination as religious freedom. This is from Religion Dispatches, and it was coverage of the contraception controversy. Should Catholic hospitals and other businesses have to provide contraceptive coverage to their employees? Obviously, Religion Dispatches has a point of view on this issue, right? This is not a neutral headline. Slate.com, no nuptials. Will opposite-sex civil unions spell the end of traditional marriage? This is about a little kind of mini movement that's taking off in Chicago. In Illinois, you can have same-sex unions, civil unions, and opposite-sex couples, and are signing up in pretty large numbers for this in Illinois. And so this is, and I put this headline here because I think it actually spells out very nicely that situation, exactly what it is that conservatives are worried about. Conservatives are worried about same-sex marriage because they argue it's going to change the institution of traditional marriage. It's going to undermine it. This article suggests that they may have a point there. Not something that perhaps we are all comfortable with acknowledging, or maybe some of us are, but it suggests that they may have something in that insight, that once you do formally define other marriage-like options, or once you define marriage as something that can be inclusive of non-traditional couples, it may well change a much more broadly our way of thinking about what marriage means, why we would enter into it, who we would enter into it with. Other things may well change. One of the things to also note about religion's role in public life, the majority of Americans now say that churches should keep out of politics, but look at when those lines moved. It hasn't been that long ago. A historically strong preference for religious involvement in public life has now taken a slight downturn, and there has been an uptick, again, in response to the politicization of religion over the last 10 to 15 years. Even about 50% of conservatives today express the view. They're more in line with moderates and liberals when they say that religion and politics shouldn't mix. Republicans and Democrats also have similar views on this. An emerging consensus that the politicization of religion has not necessarily been a good thing. All right, so that was all background to what I really want to talk about. But I think it's important background. Sociological approaches to studying religion. And yes, I am actually still going to wrap up, I think, by just about 6, maybe a little bit after 6. so we'll still have plenty of time to talk. One of the reasons I walked you through this backdrop is that this is kind of my backdrop. This is my background set of assumptions about, this is the stuff that I teach, every semester, every year when I teach my undergraduate classes. This is the stuff I think about. And a couple of years ago, out of my interest in this set of topics, I started to talk with another Torstensen lecturer, Kathy Hull, who's a professor in my department, who has studied gender and sexuality in the law. And she and I, a couple lunches, you get together, you kind of brainstorm, and because we thought it would be fun to do some research together. And we were trying to figure out, well, what do we want to do? And so my background set of assumptions was all of this stuff I'm telling you about now, about how important religion is to people in American life, this backdrop of the contestation and of political religious identities in the political arena, how things may be changing with the younger generation. And her backdrop is the law and legal institutions and how people may interact with those based on these ascribed statuses, how religion may shape that. So we started to think, well, what is it that we want to study? And we came up with a study idea that was based on a very simple hook. Everybody in America, right, everybody thinks about the culture wars, right? James Hunter talks about the culture wars, other people talk about the culture wars, the fact that we have a war, we kind of take it for granted. But what we also know is this right here, right? We also know that the culture war is really perpetuated by a relatively small number of elites and activists and knowledge workers, that it is carried forth by troops who are themselves a relatively small but highly energized and organized minority of Americans, and that there is this vast middle that is really uncomfortable with all of it, that's uncomfortable with politicization of religious identity, that is uncomfortable with the war-like rhetoric, and how they're uncomfortable with all of it. So we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to do a study where we could get at the views of ordinary Americans and how they think of religion and politics, how they think of religion and policy, how might we do something like that? And the reason that I'm taking this long route to get to here is that one of the things we found was, so we started to kick around ideas about what kind of study we would design, and we came up with something, and we got funding for it, and I'm going to tell you about that in a minute. But my first point that I want to make is just how unhelpful sociological theory was in our quest to frame and get this study off the ground. It just was so unhelpful. In the sociology of religion, there is this preoccupation with secularization theory or market theories of religion. These two theories pretty much divide up the field. People arguing that we, the late modern world, has already become secular, that we will become increasingly secular, that religion doesn't fit in advanced modern society. And this is, I'm just reading an excerpt from something I wrote because it says it better than I can do it off the top of my head. The originating and continuing impetus behind sociological inquiry into religion has been a sense that religion is at odds with modernity, and it is continually undermined by ongoing rationalization. Secularization theory was modified, it was elaborated, it was challenged, it rebounded, but it remained essentially the dominant way of thinking about religion until the late 20th century. But then some things happened. Some theoretical developments happened, and also a worldwide revival of religious identification and public religious discourse happened. In the late 20th century world, it was harder to sustain a secularization perspective. And so along comes a challenger. The most influential statement in opposition to the secularization paradigm is a market theory of religion that emphasizes that religion is a choice, it's voluntaristic, it's pluralistic, and therefore it is in fact a very good fit with modern society. So the state of the field is basically for the last 10 to 15 years has basically been opposed camps of theorists saying the world is becoming more secular. No, it's not. Yes, it is. No, it's not. Yes, it is. And that has pretty much summed up sociological research. That's a slight simplification for the purposes of that. But there's been a lot of that, right? There's been a lot of this just debate over things that are, well, first of all, that can't be adjudicated. Because a lot of times the debate is about something that is supposed to have been happening gradually over hundreds of years. It may culminate in a secular society hundreds of years in the future. Well, what evidence would work to actually tell you if that's true or not? So a lot of it really isn't about empirical things that you could go out and verify. It's more about a philosophy. What does modernity mean? What part of modernity do I like? What parts of modernity do I not like? If you tend to like modernity and think that late modern societies are fulfilling and enriching and they enhance freedom and progress, then you probably think secularization is going to happen. If you think late modern societies are morally troubling because it is difficult for us to have control over these complex bureaucratic systems that we've put into place, and as a result, our environment is going to, pardon my language, hell in a handcar, right? And all of these bad things are happening, and late modernity is kind of alienating, and it's hard to create meaning. If you think all of those things, then you probably think, well, maybe secularization isn't inevitable. Maybe you look to religion as this ground of meaning and identity that can help us grapple with the problems of the late modern world. So this debate tends to really not even be about so much anything that we can empirically verify. And as such, it is useful intellectually, and it is completely unproductive in terms of empirical grounding for your research. Moreover, secularization and market theory share a preoccupation with a particular set of relatively narrow concerns. And mostly they are concerned with the fate of organized religion in the modern world. Is it going to thrive or decline? And this is a simple numbers thing. Is it going to wax or wane in terms of authority? They are really, really interested, both market theorists and secularization theorists are really interested in this whole question of these Catholic bishops and the contraceptive controversy, right? Because it's about whether a small religious elite authority can impose its doctrinal purity on this mass of followers. And they think that's the really interesting question about religion in the late modern world. It has a cognitive view of religion that focuses on religion as something that we rationally and voluntarily assent to. None of these theories is really about religion as ritual, religion as community, religion as a deeply held identity. None of these theories really touch on that. And sociological debate then is dominated by a particular set of questions. Are we secular yet? Will we become so? And if so, when? And that has been kind of the framework that has dominated our field. And it's just really limiting for some of the kinds of research that we think is the most interesting. It's limiting because it focuses almost exclusively on the positive and pro-social aspects of religious involvement. That whole debate, are we secular yet, doesn't touch at all on, right, these questions don't touch at all on, does religion increase intolerance? Does it increase authoritarianism? Does it increase discrimination? One second, please. The definition of what religion is looks an awful lot like evangelical Protestantism, so that whole framework doesn't really help us to understand what is going on with other religious groups and movements. The growing number of Americans who identify as spiritual but not religious, where is that coming from? It's literally not on the intellectual map created by these categories. And so we just have few, so think about it, so I just list these because these are studies I think would be interesting, and these are on my long list of to get to projects, which I will never get to all of them. How conservative subcultures may be bad for women. How are there links between religion and racial discrimination? What kinds of moral communities exist amongst the non-religious? Who are non-religious? Who are those atheists, and what do they actually think about the world? You had a question.
All right. You're talking that people don't talk like whether or not religion makes people intolerant, but I think that it really does. You see it all the time in academic debates, in popular culture.
You do see some of it. You do. That research, and I guess one of the things I'm talking about is my subfield of the sociology of religion, because a lot of that really good research isn't done by sociologists of religion. It's done by political scientists, it's done by historians, it's done by other people who kind of operate outside the bounds of this kind of dominant debate. So yes, it's possible to do it, and some people have. But if your framework is really if your framework is really concerned with secularization and is that happening or not, that's not the kind of research you tend to focus on. So, yeah, but it's certainly, I've done some of that work. Some of my students have done some of that work. Mike Emerson has done some good work on some of those questions. Corey Edwards has done some good research on some of those questions. not been the kind of dominant work in the field? Good question. Again, this way of thinking about religion also directs our attention to the 10 or 15% of committed believers. It does not help us really think about questions like, why is it that the rhetoric of that 10 or 15%, why does it resonate so broadly beyond the base? What's going on with that? Is that even driven by religious belief or not? We don't really know, because I can't think actually of a single study of that. And if I do get the next big grant that I'm going to go for, I have my entire life planned until I'm like 150 in terms of what I want to, do research on. So we'll see if that works or not. But if I do get to do another like really big project, that will be it. And I think that's really a fascinating question, and I don't think any sociologist of religion is thinking about it. And I'll just go through this. This is not really important because I am running a little bit long. You people are too interesting, and it's too fun to talk to you. Okay, so we'll just kind of skip all of that. So what would this better approach look like? Because I'm kind of trying to say that when we are thinking about our project, we needed a kind of better approach, or approach that was more attuned to the kinds of questions that we wanted to ask. And we are trying to say that that better approach would recognize some forms of secularization as already having occurred. Like we could just drop the debate about whether advanced modern societies in the West are formally secular, because formally they are, and we could just kind of put a period on that and turn the page and get on with something else, perhaps. It might bracket long-term trans-historical trends, at least for the purposes of empirical inquiry, to invoke secularization questions and then go do empirical research on some completely local, limited question is not really all that helpful. That's no more than rhetoric, and it doesn't help us really get at what's going on. And I think what we really do need is a framework that introduces as central questions about religion's cultural power and institutional resources in specific social contexts. Something like this, right, that theorizes religion as part of the civic realm. Something, part of that realm which organizes and expresses the concerns of private and family life, aggregates them, engages in activism vis-a-vis the state, but something which is also influenced by the state and the economy, right? As this way of thinking about religion, and you will notice what's missing here. There's no long-term trans-historical trend. Religion is not different from other kinds of civic organizations. It has no special status vis-a-vis modernity. There's no tortured agonizing over whether or not it can exist. But this framework lets us really think about what it is that religion provides when we think about why religion might matter for public life. And I would argue that it provides three things. Religion provides identity. Religious identities in the United States consolidate and express interests, and they motivate collective action, particularly in a context in which religion becomes even more politicized. You may think, I'm Catholic, but that's not a particularly political identity. And you may be able to maintain that, but there's increasing pressure in the American context to think of that as a politicized identity, that organized interest, that you might want to vote based on, for example. Religion in the civic sphere provides culture. It provides ideas, symbols of the public good, discourses about the good society. It also provides specific beliefs that are relevant to policy debates. In local religious communities, people learn about stewardship, for example, and that might influence the way they think about environmental action. In fact, it does. There's good research that suggests if you're Christian and you hold a strong belief in stewardship, you are more likely to engage in actions in your private life that are environmentally friendly, like recycling. So there's a direct influence. And it also provides religious organizational resources. The classic example here is the civil rights movement, right? Where there was a network of pulpits and preachers and there were membership and mailing lists, and that is your organizational infrastructure that gets your message out. Question?
I was just really confused by your comment, because I remember looking at a slide earlier where they listed like the top 3 values of American religion, or religion in America, as being like preventing abortion, making sure we help the hunger and the sick, and then, if I remember correctly, preventing civilians from wars and death. But then like climate change and environmental protection were at the very bottom.
But it was about 20% of Americans who think that those are important. And whether you have been exposed to religious ideas of stewardship really is one of the things that pushes you into that 20%. So yeah, it's not a huge number, but it is a determining factor for those views. People who have been exposed to those messages are more likely to take environmental problems seriously, and they're more likely to engage in private pro-environment activities. But it is, and that's true, that is not the most common thing that religious organizations are active on. But it is an example. Does that make more sense now? So this is the way we think about religion, and it has shaped our new research project. I'm just going to introduce you to this new project briefly, and I don't think I need overheads to talk about that. And then I'll take question and answer. So we started this new research project, and we became frustrated by the dominant sociological debates. We didn't want to talk about whether people were secular or not. We didn't think that was terribly useful. What we did want to do was get people in a room and force them. Oh, am I on your range of your camera? I'm sorry, I'm back over here. I'm terrible at stuff like that. Okay. You're lucky I'm not over there. Usually I pace all up and down, and sometimes jump up and down. But okay, Americans talking about social controversies. We wanted to get people in a room. We wanted to get them in focus groups, and we wanted to get them talking about controversial social issues. And we wanted to do it in a way that wouldn't just assume that it was all going to be organized by this left versus right culture wars, right? But we knew we knew if we got a bunch of elites in a room, that's what we would get. We would get the left position and we would get the right position, and they would be articulated very eloquently. And if we put those folks in the same group, they would fight. Like, we knew that. But we thought, if we get ordinary Americans in rooms, getting them talking about some controversial issues, is that going to happen? And we suspect, of course, that it is not going to happen, and we suspected when we started the research it would not happen. But then when we were writing this grant proposal, we couldn't think, it was actually not easy for us to generate any kind of predictions about what would happen. There just hasn't been a lot of research on it. So my co-PI and I, along with our grad students, went to the National Science Foundation, and we proposed to them, we said what is important is that we start to think about primary research that can identify the sources of commonality and consensus amongst ordinary Americans, and also the sources of fragmentation and division. If it isn't a left-right culture war amongst the vast middle, what is it? Because we suspect that it's also not just one big happy ground of consensus, right? But what are the fault lines, and what are the sources of commonality? So we did focus groups, and we gave them vignettes of 3 social issues: faith-based prison ministry, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis of human embryos. This is something that occurs once you've already, for example, done in vitro fertilization and you're trying to decide which embryos to implant. Is it okay? So, and this is something that is happening right now. You can get genetic tests in those embryos to determine if they have susceptibility for particular kinds of diseases. Potentially, you could get genetic testing to see, like, how tall are they going to be and what is their IQ going to be. So one of the things we wanted to do was to get people talking about that. Is that okay or not? What are the moral implications of that? And then parental refusal of medical treatment for a dependent child. This is a new issue. It doesn't necessarily map onto the old culture wars dichotomies. Faith-based prison ministry, a lot of the groups that do it are evangelical, but also a lot of liberal religious groups are involved in it, so we thought that might kind of span the political spectrum. This is our issue that is closest to the culture wars, and we thought, well, if people are going to have pre-packaged left-right views, this is the issue where it's going to come out. And this is a really old, classic church-state question in the American context, right? We've had controversies over Jehovah's Witnesses and a whole bunch of Christian Scientists, right? We gave it a new twist. The way we set up the vignette, the people who were refusing medical treatment were refusing it based on their participation in a Native Americans group whose spirituality was violated by this kind of modern Western medicine. So this one was really set up to get at views not only of separation of church and state, but again, your views of smaller, less popular, less well-known religious minorities in the American context. We did 36 groups, 12 groups per city, and we also did pre and post interviews with 2 members of each group so that we could get some sense of, did people come in already knowing what they thought? Did participating in the focus group change their views at all? And then we followed up with them 6 weeks or so later. Our assumptions here are worth outlining because our assumptions, again, have nothing to do, we did not assume that you can easily line people up according to how secular versus how religious they are and that that's really going to make a big difference here. We also didn't assume that religion would have a privileged relationship to people's views on these social issues. We thought that people's experiences with religion might matter, but also their exposure to scientific and legal forms of expert discourse or their own experiences and their own encounters with the law or with science might influence their views. We thought that division and fragmentation stem from cultural cleavages that are not rooted in a liberal, conservative, religious divide. And again, we also wanted to identify sources of commonality that the culture wars media coverage dismisses. So where do we go from here? We are mired right in the middle of data coding. I wish I had like big sexy findings that I could share with you, but right now, I really do. I'm really tired of being mired in the middle of this. This is just like this huge, unwieldy, like thousands of pages of transcripts kind of project. And so my co-PI and I at the moment have basically just dumped all of that on our grad students and said, come back and meet with us periodically and let us know what's going on. And they're really doing it. They're great. They're out there. They think this is interesting. They're not jaded and old yet. So they think this is fabulous and they're out there coding. And they've got like a third of it done and they will have another third of it done by the end of April. And then they'll finish up in early June. So this is what we're coded for, right? All of these things. We stratified the groups. We have some non-religious groups and some religious groups. So in case religiosity does make a big difference, we can check for that. So we're in the middle of coding. What I want to leave you with then is a set of thoughts about why it matters to do a project like this, since I can't really leave you with findings. We did have a pilot study. The pilot study did suggest that there are, in fact, many sources of commonality that you miss if you only focus on these culture wars, elite kind of discourses. One of the big sources of commonality is that people draw on their own life experiences, and in particular their own family experiences. And in a group-based discourse, when people invoke family as a metaphor, it creates a kind of bridge, and you actually see people constructing a much more common and consensual framework then for grappling with the problem versus invoking other kinds of metaphors to understand it. We are really hoping that that one holds up in our broader study. We didn't have very many groups for our pilot study, so we're not sure. So we do suspect we will find some sources of commonality. But I hope, since I don't really have findings, to just leave you with a thought about why it might matter to do work like this. We have a changing 20th century, 21st century American landscape. We have a growing visibility of religious minorities. There's a growing legitimacy of opting out of organized religion. There is mobilization around new issues. Sociological theory is also changing. We have changing understandings of modernity. We are beginning to think of people's identities as more fluid and hybrid, and we have a rejection of big master narratives like secularization. So what I want to argue is the stakes of a project like this have something to do with the findings themselves, right, to the extent to which we can comment on whether, religious minorities. It doesn't matter if you're an unpopular religious minority, right? Are people still willing to grant you the kind of autonomy that they would grant a more established religious minority? So certainly the stakes have to do with the substance of what we're going to find, but the stakes also have to do with developing a way of thinking about and analyzing religion that is simply more compatible with this 21st century landscape. The stakes really are just relevance to what is actually going on in religion and public life in the United States, and developing a set of theoretical categories, a set of focused questions that can help orient us to what is happening in the 21st century, not what happened in the transition from the 19th to the 20th, because that is what's driving our theorizing now, and it is increasingly less helpful as we move forward into the future. Okay, thank you. And I told you there would be time for questions, so. You have not asked a question yet, or did you ask one earlier? Go ahead.
I made a comment.
Okay.
My name is Brad Holt. I teach religion here.
Oh,
So,
did I I get my facts and figures right?
Well, I found myself very much convinced by what you said today,
Excellent.
yeah, particularly about changing the question to be asked.
Okay, good.
Yesterday I said to my class, early in the 20th century, people expected religion to wither and die as people became more educated, and it hasn't happened
No.
with great difference from what they expected. So come to hear the lecture. I'm sure I don't see any of them here, unfortunately. There are two sorts of things I'm interested in what you said. First of all, yes, I found your approach to the questions to be asked much more fruitful than what you described earlier. I have two areas of questions. One is if I can understand better the relationship between rationality, modernity, and the Enlightenment. That is to say, religious groups since the 1700s have adapted in various ways to the emphasis upon reason and a particular kind of reason in the Enlightenment. And I'm just playing in my own mind with the pluses and minuses of the Enlightenment for religious belief. Because I think one of the big differences between Americans, Western Europeans, and most of the rest of the world is that our culture has gone through the Enlightenment, whereas those cultures have not had that strain and that benefit of going through the Enlightenment. So I try to think about that. My second area of interest is something you didn't talk about, and that is the terms religiosity, which I think has been a common sociological term, which many people have found very problematic in practice, and the term spirituality. You hinted about the common phrase, I'm spiritual but not
Yes.
religious. You didn't really go into that question very deeply in your lecture today,
Sure.
and I'm not asking you to make a lecture about it, but that it interests me because this group who doesn't identify with a religious group may have very strong religious beliefs and or spiritual practices or religious practices. I think it's very hard to draw a line between them. So if you could just think with me a little bit about
Sure.
either of those two areas of
Sure.
thought.
I'll start with the second one. I've thought about it more. So things I can say that might be helpful or interesting. In the United States, about, it's 2/3 of Americans will strongly identify as being spiritual. At least 2/3. Most of those folks will, again, if you think about, and survey data has its strengths, it has its limits. And the strength is you can ask a few thousand people and you can feel like you're representing some broader set of views. The limit is that you have this relatively, you have no time and there's only so much you can ask and you can't ask open-ended things and you can't say to people, hey, what did that mean? So that's your limit,
And they can't ask you that either.
And they can't ask you that either. No, that's right. And in fact, if they do say, what do you mean? You're instructed to tell them, just answer the question, right?
Is America a Christian nation? Oh, wow. What do you mean by that?
Exactly. No, if they ask that, you were said, just answer the question, right? So about 2/3 of Americans will identify as spiritual. Most of those folks will also identify as religious. So for most people, it's a both and. About 20-some%, 22, 24, again, we see different figures, percent of Americans will say, I'm spiritual but not religious. What is interesting, I think, is that for both of those groups, to claim the spiritual label seems to be associated with a kind of critical stance toward organized religious groups. That is to say, even amongst people who are themselves members of those groups, who
Yes.
still go to church. And I just think that's fascinating, right? This is a way, again, I think it's interesting, just like I think it's fascinating that atheists are now organizing themselves in a way that's consciously oppositional. I think adopting a language of spirituality is consciously oppositional for many people. Yeah, it's either mildly so or kind of strongly so. And so I think that, those things tell us that there is this sense in which, some vast number of Americans, and particularly, again, people who are, 35 and younger, really are concerned about the corruption of traditional religious institutions in our society. Corruption, but because of its their association with political power.
But you haven't mentioned the Catholic sex scandal
The Catholic
in your
sex
analysis.
scandal.
I
That's
wonder if that was in the 90s, if that had an effect.
Oh, I think that had a big impact. I do. I think it's true. I have not mentioned that, but I think that had a large impact as well. I think what you would see, and I know what you would see, if there hadn't been a really big increase in immigration from Mexico and other Latin American countries in the 90s, what you would have seen was a decline among Catholics that mirrors the decline in moderate to liberal white Protestants, right? And that flight of white Catholics in the 90s from those churches is very much also driven by the scandal. Now, what happened though is a lot of white Catholics who left the Catholic Church did join other churches. They were slightly more likely to join other churches, whereas white Protestants who left their churches just left. But yeah, no, I think there is, when I was in graduate school, I will not tell you how long ago that was, of course, if you remember, he actually said it. When I got my grad, I'm going to have to stop putting that in my bio. So when I was in grad school, there was this interesting article that came out in the American Sociological Review, and it was all about religion as a source of cultural power. And it was based on case studies of religious activism in local communities. And it basically argued that religious leaders could speak out so effectively in these local community arenas because everybody assumed that they were disinterested. And everybody assumed that if a religious leader is speaking out, it's because they have a genuine moral critique. They assumed that they were not motivated by money or economic interests. It assumed they were not motivated by political interests. That article could not be written today. Well, that article could be written today, but you wouldn't find that. You could still do a study of local religious activism, but even in local religious arenas, I don't think you would find that today. And I think that's the big story. People in response to that, needed a language to claim the religious part of what mattered to them in that identity, but put distance between themselves and institutions that they thought were corrupt for various reasons. And in general, again, people under the age of 35, really people under the age of 45, but especially people under the age of 35, are suspicious of a wide range of institutions in our society. And that's been happening for a long time. But it didn't happen regarding religion until relatively late. It didn't really happen in large numbers until the 90s. And I'm certain that things like the sex scandal figured into that, the politicization of religious discourse, the abortion controversy, all of this, all of those things undermined this sense that religious leaders were disinterested and speaking out solely for moral reasons.
I don't want you to pursue my other question because I'm taking too much time.
Okay, all right.
I want other people to get a chance.
Okay. There were other questions.
I'm Scott Ingram, I'm a student in the sociological senior Keystone class right now.
Hi, Scott.
And I was wondering this might be sort of the reason why you're doing this, but saying that asking are we secular yet is the wrong question. First, is that the general opinion of most sociologists still today, wondering why, when we're going to be, and if that's better, and if it is if it is eventually going to be that way, and with that, is there any problems as a discipline of sociology taking the value statement that society ultimately be better as a secular society, when such a high number of people have claimed
That's a
or
great
things
question.
that-
Those are great questions. I would say the dominant framework in sociology right now amongst sociologists of religion is not secularization theory, it's this market theory of religion. So I think most sociologists would say, and they would actually probably say it in that kind of way too. These are people with a committed stance, right? They're like, see, look, we were right, secularization theory is wrong. And they would point to things like, there's really been a kind of a very big revival of enthusiastic Pentecostal forms of Christianity in the global South. There have been other kinds of religious revivals in other parts of the world in the late 20th century. They would point to the infusion of religion in politics, in the Middle East and other parts that are not Western, pretty much everywhere they would say that's not Western Europe. They would point to high rates of religious believing and belonging even in the US and other supposedly highly modern societies, and they would say, look, the secularization story was wrong. There's still, though, a fair amount of pushback on that. Like, there are still articles being written, like in the American Sociological Review and the Annual Review of Sociology, and people pushing back against that. And what results from that is just, that just tends to kind of come to dominate our discourse and take up so much space. These other kinds of perspectives, and again, it's not that there aren't people doing research on some of these other things, but they kind of get squeezed out. They get squeezed out from the journals, they get squeezed out from the conference sessions. And I think that, and I think in terms of where most sociologists would come down in terms of their private commitments, I think most sociologists have a kind of a pro-religion stance. They tend to emphasize that religion is a source of morals and values and ethics, that religion is a source of morally rooting identities. They tend to emphasize in the American context, at least, that's where I know the most, right, research. Religion is most often treated as a source of social capital, community resource, so it tends to take a pretty pro-religion stance. So I think, and in that sense, I think the sociological community is kind of very much in line with kind of mainstream understandings of religion. Even most Americans will not on these surveys be critical of religious persons. They're highly in favor of religion and religious persons. They're concerned about religious leaders and religious organizations and religion and politics. So I think most Americans have a pretty strong pro-religion stance, and I think that's mirrored in the discipline.
Thank you very much. My name is Hans Wers, and I also teach in the religion department. And I appreciate especially your differentiating the critique, secularization versus marketplace, and I think I've been guilty of those, so I like this new way of presenting the question. It's very helpful for me. Also appreciate the fact you're interested in the broad middle.
Okay.
What I've been interested in is this minority that continues nevertheless to grow of the people who self-identify as atheists, and which you term as sort of an oppositional strategy to religion. I'm also aware that we have a student from this school who's been involved in this movement, and that is presenting an atheistic worldview more positively, in a more evangelical way, let's say, to present its benefits. So
soon they'll have potlucks.
with Jell-O.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess I would just like to hear you, you're thinking about this minority but nevertheless growing and their strategy within the culture to win more adherents.
Oh, no, I definitely think, I do think that it's, I think that's also driven by, one of the things that drives that is these generational differences. So atheist groups and the Freedom from Religion Foundation is actually somewhat old-fashioned, right? It's still a kind of grass in the way it organizes. But a lot of these other groups are internet-based, and they're driven by a younger generation that's really savvy for how to use that to build infrastructure quickly. And I want to make it clear when I say that too, I do not think that groups that are organized in and through the internet are different than other groups. I think that the internet is something that is kind of a both and, right? These virtual communities map onto groups and help them to establish much more quickly traditional kinds of infrastructure for activism. Everything, mailing lists and donation lists and all of those kind of means of communication, all of those things that we have always studied for social movements. But I think these atheist groups are really savvy about using them. They are also pursuing, at least the atheist community, at least in the US and Canada, is pursuing at least a three-pronged strategy. One is this kind of internet-based organization to get groups and organizations that are just as big as you can, big networks. They're also doing a lot of local chapters, local chapter building, college campuses, small towns, bigger towns, discussion groups, right, organizations, coffee house meetings, kinds of things. And they're building intellectual centers. I got asked to, and I could not go, I got asked to give a talk at a university in Canada that's basically a center for the study of atheism and secular humanism. Those are still not super common, but more and more there are centers, or there are named chairs, or there's money being deployed in academic institutions to create space for a kind of an intellectual study of this. So that's, I mean, if you think about that, that's exactly the same three-pronged strategy that evangelicals started to pursue in the 1960s and 70s, which became the Christian Coalition in the 1980s. It's the same strategy that the religious left is pursuing now and has pursued over the last 5 to 10 years. So it's, there is some infrastructure building there.
The other interesting component to that is that there is a secular humanist chaplain, right, at Harvard.
Yes, yes.
And there's a push for chaplains in the military as well,
Yes.
secular humanist chaplains.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they're not going to just be having potlucks.
Yeah, no, that's right, yeah. Well, but I mean, I think potlucks, when I say that, I mean is they are mimicking these religious
Yeah,
organizational
absolutely.
forms because they work. That's right, chaplaincies.
Mhm.
I still think you should do potlucks. No, but I think I got interviewed by a reporter who was, and I didn't actually know about the chaplaincies in the military until they interviewed me about that, and they were, yeah. But that's very much, they are saying we want parallel organizations, right? Parallel strategies.
It throws the whole secularization theory on its head.
It does.
Yeah, right.
It does. When the atheist says, "I want to organize a
Yeah.
chaplaincy," right?
Right, exactly.
But it's interesting, right? It's to me too. All of these things really point to similar kinds of things to this movement toward embracing spirituality, which is to suggest that what I would think of as religiosity, right, or individual searches for meaning, belonging, cosmologies that make sense and explain the world, morally rooting identities. That is just kind of, it's busting out all over and in ways that are just not compatible with these older religious institutional structures. And I think that it's just, it is really reconfiguring the religious landscape. And probably will reconfigure it even more radically over the next couple of generations.
Has there been any trend or information concerning, I don't want to say secularization now because it may not be the case.
That's okay.
In like European countries or in certain religiously charged, whether it's Christian or Jewish or Islam countries, has the desire for secularization or a government without any religion to it had any effect here in the United States? More specifically on our values, not necessarily our government, but I mean for regular everyday people, are they kind of getting any feedback from that and thinking, why don't we try this?
Are you asking whether there are groups of organized groups in the U.S. who want a more secular public sphere?
No, I'm more wondering if there's kind of, if there's a connection or a trading of values because there's this movement in Europe or in parts of Europe for countries where there is no religion, or then in other areas where like in Egypt or in Iran or in places where they're thinking about the possibilities of a more secular or less religion-oriented society. Does that have any impact on American society and everyday values?
Yes, that's a really good question. That's a really good question, and the honest answer is I'm not sure. I don't know. I mean, I don't know of any research on that. I do know that most people approach the American context as though most of the changes are driven by by factors, endogenous to the United States. They really have tended to think not about, say, transnational flows of ideas or transnational social movements. But that is not at all the case, that doesn't necessarily mean that that isn't the case. I do know that in the U.S., politically, it's not terribly popular to look to Europe as examples. And so I don't know if that is part of the story. I do know a lot of the generational changes in religiosity in the U.S. are driven more by economics and demographics and less by other kinds of factors. But that's a really good question, and I don't know that anybody has really looked at it. So, and you might get the last word with your really good question.
Maybe we have 2 questions.
Okay. All right.
Maybe these can be the last 2 questions.
Sure.
And small. I was just wondering if in your research people self-identified as conservative or how you mapped that?
Oh, in our research, we asked people both their party affiliation, but we also asked them, would you consider yourself a social conservative, yes or no? Would you consider yourself a social liberal, yes or no? And we also asked about economic conservatism and liberalism, which people did identify as, but it didn't matter for any of our measures.
And then part 2 is that are you considering atheists to be conservative, liberal, or not in the mix at all in terms of religiosity?
I don't consider them to be either, but all the data suggests that atheists are off the charts liberal compared to even liberal Protestant groups. When you map their political and social attitudes.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
Earlier, Scott even asked a question based on being in the course, our senior seminar course,
Mhm.
which was kind of a meta question
Sure.
about the discipline of sociology, and I have a question that's similar
Okay.
to that. You had mentioned that there's 1, maybe 2 questions that dominate the specialty, sociology of religion,
Mhm.
and that you're finding them unhelpful,
Mhm.
and that there are other areas of specialty within sociology that are asking the kinds of questions about religion
Mhm.
that you yourself are interested in.
Yes.
And later you showed that there are connections between religion and issues like identity
Yes.
and culture
Mhm.
and organizations
Mhm.
and so on. So my question has to do with stepping outside of the discipline of sociology and looking back at it.
Mhm.
The question of specialization within the discipline.
Mhm.
I'm wondering, what do you think is gained and what is lost as we specialize into all of these different
Yeah.
subfields within the discipline of sociology?
Well, I think that's a really excellent question. I do think that some things are gained, right? So boundaries provide a sense of identity, and they provide, so when you think about people in graduate school making a transition into the profession, having things like the religion section or the culture section or the political section, it gives you a place to go, it helps you to network and meet other people who are interested in your topic area. And those things, I think, are useful, that part of it, in terms of just making people findable for one another and sparking conversations, particularly for younger people in the field. Then I think that the danger is not that we have those identifications or specialties, but that's all we have, right? And it's exactly the same way in our university, right? I actually don't think it's bad that we have departments that are organized by disciplines, like history and sociology. But then what we have in terms of interdisciplinarity is lip service. We have resources devoted to disciplines. Disciplines can hire people and fire people and tenure people and train people and give degrees. A lot of money goes into all of that. For interdisciplinary things, we have speaker series and things that don't actually cost any money or draw on anyone's time, right? And so the problem isn't, I think, that we specialize, is that we devote no resources to the serious building of structures which have some resources attached to them that would foster and even force these cross-specialty dialogues. And we could dedicate a certain number of ASA sessions to to cross-specialty panels, and we could do that. And they do some of that at the ASA at the annual meeting. They do some thematic panels, but again, that's something that exists institutionally. If you think about where it exists in that limited time and space of the annual meeting itself. There's no, whereas the sections, the specialty stuff, that's this ongoing, enduring organizational structure. And so, you know, maybe you could have something where you are a member of, you know, I don't know what you'd even call them, like you have discipline-based specialties, but maybe you would be a member of thematic working groups, and they could have some kind of real reality that spans the, you know, when you're not just having the meeting. But I think, I think there are some real problems associated with but not so much with the fact of specialization, but with the fact that specialization carries with it all of the resources right now in academics. So it undercuts any genuine push toward interdisciplinary dialogue, in my view.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. With that, thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.